Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning into episode 13 of the Fourth String Sports Podcast. I am your host, Brady, here with my co-hosts, Mitch. Mitchell, say hi.
What up? What up?
There you go. That time you got it right. And Skylar, the other co-host.
What's up?
All right. Perfect, boys. Today we are breaking down the Detroit Lions, the second NFC North team that we've covered. We've talked about the Lions a couple of times in correspondence to the Bears episode, as well as the Cardinals episode, Falcons episode, and the Panthers episode. And I'm sure that there's one or two in there that I might be missing. But go back, listen to those episodes, go through the predictions on that stuff. Please, guys, follow us on YouTube, Fourth String Sports Podcast. We're also on SoundCloud and Spotify, Fourth String Sports Podcast, and on Facebook and Twitter. And you can always reach us at email at fourthstringsp@gmail.com. Send us your thoughts, your comments, stuff like that. We will read them on air if they're interesting, if you guys got any interesting points. Lot of interesting developments in the sports world. We had a pretty devastating injury to a team that we've all, at various levels, been pretty high on in Philadelphia. We're going to give a quick shout out to the MLB, as it looks like they've turned things around really quickly. We're also going to talk about a little bit of NCAA in terms of one specific Division III football team that has an interesting development. And then on the next episode, we're going to talk a little bit more about the NCAA and their developments in terms of returning to athletics, especially with football. And we're going to break down the team that me and Mitch root for the most, the Green Bay Packers, on the next episode. So I do appreciate everybody for tuning in. So let's hop into it. Mitch, you wanted to talk about St. Thomas, the Division III team out of, I think they're in Ohio, if I remember.
Nope, Minnesota.
Minnesota. Oh, okay,
Yep,
Minnesota. There you go.
Minnesota.
Oh, because it's St. Thomas versus St. John's or something every year? Isn't that the whole?
Yeah, something like that.
Thomas?
St. John's. St. John's is Ohio, I believe.
Oh, whatever it is. All right.
Yeah.
So, Mitch, what do you want to talk about in relation to them?
So some interesting developments came from the NCAA. It looks like starting next year in 2021, they're going to let D3 teams have possible a pathway straight to D1. But apparently the council that kind of decides on that is going to let St. Thomas get a head start on that. And I imagine that they're going to have a pretty good chance of becoming a D1 school. And just a refresher for everybody who doesn't know a lot about St. Thomas, their football team was so good that they got kicked out of their own conference for being that good.
Yeah, they. Me and Mitch being in Wisconsin, the Division III team here, UW-Whitewater, one of them. It was pretty much them and St. Thomas every single year in the Division III national championship for what was it? It was like 8 straight seasons.
Yeah.
It was those two guys going against
At
each
least.
other. They are a powerhouse program. And if I'm not mistaken, they're the college that I believe Pierre Garçon came from, the former Colts and Redskins wide receiver, great football player. They got kicked out of their league, wasn't it one game into their season last year? They kicked the crap out of someone in their conference, and then the conference threatened to disband if they weren't kicked out of the conference because they were so good.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous. Imagine if the SEC threatened to disband because Alabama was winning as often as they were winning, or the ACC threatened to disband because Clemson kept winning the conference. I know it's D3, but that's still astonishing to think about, that your entire conference threatened to disband because you were winning so often.
Why couldn't we do that with Arrowhead?
What?
High school. It's different.
Truth. Oh my God, no! Arrowhead University, Jesus Christ!
Oh.
They built.
Sorry.
No. They're a high school, but we call them Arrowhead University. They built, what was it, Mitch? A $600 million locker room for just their high school basketball team.
Yeah, for women's basketball.
Yeah, it was ridiculous. State of the art. It probably wasn't $600 million, but it was ridiculous.
Two campuses.
Two campuses. This is where a bunch of University of Wisconsin football players came from. There's been a few guys who go to Michigan and Michigan State and stuff like that. In fact, I think we talked about him on the Baltimore episode. Didn't Ben Bredesen go to Ben Bredesen?
Arrowhead.
Yeah, the former
Arrowhead
Michigan player who just got drafted by Baltimore went to Arrowhead. And this is who we had to play against every year. They're ridiculous. But I think that it's ridiculous that the conference threatened to disband over one team. That's absolutely ridiculous. Now, Mitch, I have a question. When you talk about going D3 to D1, by D1, do you mean FCS or FBS?
Let me check my notes real quick.
Because from what I believe I saw, I think it was FCS. Because for those of you who don't remember, college football is split into a few divisions. There's the FBS, which is talking about Nebraska and Ohio State and Bama and Clemson. And then there's FCS, and this is where you're getting your like North Dakota states and some teams like that. And then you have Division II, and then you have Division III. So D1, like depending on who you talk about with D1, they can mean either FCS or FBS.
Well, and the classification in that too doesn't just go on like size of school like it would in some high schools. It goes more on how they treat student athletes. Because as it was explained to me, Division III doesn't treat a student athlete any different than it would treat a normal student, where it's
Correct.
like they're like you don't get scholarships based on your athletic ability. You get
Correct.
scholarships based off of academics. I go to a Division II school, which means that they get some of their athletics, but very rarely is it a full ride.
Yep.
And then Division I is full ride. You get all of the money, pay, like your athletic ability can pay for your entire college experience.
Correct. Yeah. So Division III, there's no athletic scholarships. Division II, there are some that can be offered, but it's very limited. FCS is then dependent. Like FCS teams can move into FBS all the time.
I think Liberty
UMass,
and
yeah,
Charlotte
Liberty,
and UMass were the
yep,
most
are all
were
teams who
in
have
Old
moved up.
Dominion.
As well as teams can move from FBS down to FCS. Like the University of Idaho used to be
Yeah,
FBS,
they just recently did that.
and they moved down to FCS. So you can kind of switch, but it's very difficult to move up or move down.
And also-
and as you can see, there's a huge difference in competition. The University of Massachusetts used to be a stud in FCS, and they've gotten to the FBS and they haven't performed as well. And there's a big drop in competition. But either or, to go from D3 up to FCS or FBS, I believe it's FCS, is a huge jump for them. Did you figure it out, Mitch?
Yeah, I just looked at the NCAA's like official statement about what this new process is going to be about, and they do not clarify about whether the teams would go to FCS or right to the FBS. It just says Division I. So
I
might have
would
to do
assume that
something.
would be FCS.
it
Well,
must be
probably,
like a
yeah.
case by case basis. The committee or the council kind of decides which, like, if you're going to go to FCS or FBS.
Well, I mean, it's the same for almost every sport. I mean, we know that like teams like Richmond or I'm even thinking like some of the like Ivy League schools, like the Ivy League in basketball is completely different than it is in football. Whereas like, I would say that it probably depends on that too.
Yeah.
Correct. As well as some divisions and some conferences require that you have a certain amount of Division I or whatever it might be sports, which is one reason why when teams like the University of Connecticut were cutting a lot of their sports programs, they were maybe running into issues where they didn't have enough active sports teams to be considered an FBS team. Like I believe the requirement is you have to have 6 men and I believe 5 women, if I remember that correctly.
Something like
Don't
that.
necessarily quote me on that. So when teams were cutting their track programs or when teams were cutting their baseball programs or stuff, then they ran into that issue, basically just on budget cuts. So I mean, that is interesting. Hopefully we'll get some more updates on that, but it is a little bit ridiculous that an entire conference threatened to disband because one team was too good at football.
They do that with Ohio State in the Big Ten. Can we just like kick Ohio State out, make them go somewhere else?
I mean, if Ohio State hadn't in the last couple of seasons been blown out by Purdue and Iowa, then yeah, maybe. But, every now and
I
then.
mean, kick Michigan out for just being annoying.
Yeah, right? I'd be fine kicking Michigan
Oh no, if we're
out.
just going annoying, Iowa.
I don't know. If we're going annoying, I got to say Minnesota. Because if I got to listen to PJ Fleck talk one more time, I think I might punch him in his bald face.
Hey, row the boat. Row the boat.
Row the boat. Jesus Christ. Like, what?
It works.
And now Minnesota has canoes on their helmet. Like, they've got paddles on their helmet. Like, what are you
It
talking
works.
about? Yeah,
If it didn't work, they wouldn't have gone 10 wins last year.
I mean,
But why would a Golden Gopher need to row a boat?
Yeah, right? Gophers
Because it's
can't
the land
swim,
of 10,000
dumbass.
lakes. It's the land of 10,000 lakes.
Wisconsin has more lakes, by the way. There was a study that was done about
There's
it.
one state it makes sense for. It's Minnesota.
No.
I would say what a gopher is, but it's not appropriate for this kind of setting.
Yeah, a gopher is just a badger who was unfortunately born with some form of a learning disability. So
You said it, not me.
Yeah, but I mean, learning disability does not necessarily mean a bad thing. It could mean like Asperger's. It could mean like savant syndrome. It's just because you take it the wrong way doesn't mean that other people will. But in
Yeah,
this
they can be
case,
ridiculously
it is
smart, but
meant
you
to
just
take the
think
wrong
that they're
way.
dumb.
Yeah, yeah. I
Like
mean, the
Rain
University of
Man.
Minnesota is a great university. Like, it's a world accredited university, but I never want to see I've watched the Gophers take the axe from Wisconsin, and I never want to see it again in my life. That filled me with rage. They took it to the county fair. Like, they took it to the fair and let people parade around with it. Like, fuck that. But
Well,
whatever.
just look at
I'm
all of
heated.
Minnesota sports. They're all
Yeah,
like that.
true. Yeah, they're
I
all
mean, look at the
trash.
Vikings. Instead of
Vikings,
parading
the
about
Timberwolves.
Super Bowl, instead of celebrating Super Bowl wins, they celebrate sacking Aaron Rodgers and breaking his collarbone.
Truth. Yeah, truth.
That's all
The
they
greatest
got.
contribution to the world of sports to date.
Yeah, right. But then we also have to talk about the really unfortunate development out of Philadelphia, which was the Brandon Brooks, their fantastic guard, goes down with a torn Achilles and will miss the entirety of the 2020 season. I was very high on Philadelphia, and you can go through and listen to some of the previous episodes, especially the Dallas episode. I thought Philadelphia had finally put it all together to get back to the level that they were at after winning the Super Bowl. Yeah, they made the playoffs the last two seasons, but you could just tell it wasn't the same Philadelphia team. And now this loss it's crucial. Like, it's unfortunately, it's devastating. We're already talking about, can Carson Wentz play a full season, and to lose an all-star offensive lineman like that is brutal for that organization.
Yeah, I definitely think he's a linchpin for that success for that offensive line. And then just kind of taking a look at their depth chart about how it's constructed right now. The next man up would be backup Matt Pryor, who's kind of a journeyman, or else they're looking at a rookie starter at that right guard position. So I think it's definitely going to hinder that offense, especially since you got Andre Dillard taking over for Jason Peters, the left tackle. Jason Kelsey's getting up there in age, and your only reliable starter now is Lane Johnson.
And Lane Johnson has unfortunately struggled with not only injuries, but as well as suspensions in the NFL.
Exactly.
So you just feel like, I don't feel like it's completely devastating, but I feel like if there's a game where Kelsey goes down or where Johnson goes down, it completely ruins Philadelphia. Like Philadelphia had a bad offensive line or a bad wide receiver core last year, and Philadelphia has had issues at the quarterback position staying healthy and at the running back position. But the thing they could count on was that offensive line. It was sturdy. And now their previous best resource now has a huge question mark on it. And for a team in Philadelphia that I had as Super Bowl aspirations, that I had going really far this season, completely screws up my season predictions and completely throws a wrench in the way that the NFC, which is already hyper competitive, is going to look in 2020.
Well, there's one scenario I think they could do is kick Andre Dillard to the guard position and try to get Jason Peters back in a one-year deal, because he's still out there. So you could still get him to play left tackle. Then I believe Dillard is versatile enough to play guard.
Well, the thing that just screws it all up for me and making it is we're already in this unpredictable off season. Teams still haven't met, like we were talking about, and if all goes to plan, they won't be doing full contact drills or any kind of those things anytime soon. So getting that, the thing that I learned as a Nebraska fan this last year is that cohesion on the offensive line is needed, no matter how good the players are. If they don't know each other and they don't work together, especially when we're talking about Brandon, it's such a key piece of that offensive line. It's detrimental for offensive success. So I'm also really kind of sad because as much as I don't like Philly fans, I really like Philadelphia as a team. I really like what they've built. I've always liked Carson Wentz. I loved his underdog approach to most of the things he did. And he's a Midwest guy, which you gotta love. So it's just kind of like you guys were saying, it screws up their Super Bowl aspirations, which they do have. They're a Super Bowl caliber team, but last year when they had all their problems with weapons, the thing that kept them going and why they beat Dallas is because Carson Wentz could sit back there and find somebody to throw it to, whether it was the third string wide receiver or a converted quarterback. Um, that's what allowed them. If they don't have,
Yeah.
especially on his blind side, it's gonna be bad.
I mean, the thing that you guys got to remember is that there was a point last season where like Seattle was thought to be the best team in the NFC, and with Josh McCown at quarterback, the Eagles almost beat the Seahawks in the wild card round of the playoffs. And the only reason that they did that with a series of nobodies at the wide receiver position was in large part because of how strong that offensive line is. And let me just run through the first 6 opponents Philadelphia has to play this upcoming season.
Fucking brutal.
At Washington, which their strength already defensively is on that defensive line, versus the Rams, so they got to go up against Aaron Donald, versus Cincinnati, who we talked about with Geno Atkins and DJ Reader are going to be a lot better. At San Francisco, who has the best defensive line in the NFL. At Pittsburgh, who has an extremely underrated defense, versus Baltimore, who got better on the defensive line with the additions of Derek Wolfe and Calais Campbell. Like, that's a brutal stretch. And it's a stretch that now without him, and even if they do sign
Jason
Peters back and move Dillard inside, I don't know if Philadelphia wins more than 2 of those 6 games. I don't. And 2 is generous. Like 2 is Carson Wentz has to ball out, because that is a brutal first stretch of the season. Like that might be the worst first stretch of the season that any team has to come across. And just when you think, oh, well, it's better because they have to play Cincinnati. Well, now you're out your guard who has to go up against Geno Atkins, who's one of the only players to be elected to the Pro Bowl each of the last 5 seasons. And DJ Reader, a sneakily good defensive tackle as well. Like that's difficult. That becomes
plus those
brutal.
defensive ends.
Yeah, correct. Plus those defensive ends. Like I feel so bad for Carson Wentz because I want to see him play a full season just to beat the naysayers. But now it's like without that guard,
Yeah.
I don't know if it's going to happen.
Well,
Yeah.
something that I also need to think. This is when like we've been talking. Like I've always considered the Philadelphia coach, like just trying to like think about like what he did on that run when he was able to get Nick Foles to play like the best he's ever played in his entire career. Yeah, godly, literally. That he needs, if he is as good of a coach as we all really think that he is, I think that he wins 3 of those 6 games. If he can figure a way. Because what I'll tell you is the Philadelphia team is much improved, like already improved of what they were last year, and they retained a lot of core pieces. I mean, I know losing Jason Peters was important. Still, like we'll see what happens with them. I hope they pull it through, because again, I really like Philly as a team. Their fans, them as a team, I like them.
Yeah, it'll just be interesting to see how they're going to address this offensive line, because as you said, Brady, the offensive line strength was kind of what kept the team together, especially last year, and led them to almost being Seattle in the playoffs. And with that kind of being compromised, then you're looking at an injury-prone quarterback, 2 injury-prone starters at wide receiver, and a bunch of unknowns for the rest of the core, and then a solid back in Sanders, and then Zach Ertz and Dallas Goedert as a good tight end set. But I think, if they can't address it, you're right, they're definitely going to struggle, and 2 wins against that 6-game stretch is probably a hope.
And like to Skylar's point, and obviously we'll talk about it when we get to the Philadelphia episode, but to Skylar's point, this is already a ridiculous offseason in terms of a lack of development and a lack of cohesion that's going to happen. And now you're going to throw this wrench in the middle of it. Ridiculous. The only other thing that I did want to talk about before we hop into Detroit was the NFL testing several players, and several players on both the Dallas Cowboys as well as the Houston Texans coming back as testing positive for COVID-19. One of those including Ezekiel Elliott. Now, Ezekiel Elliott did make a really good point in that there is a thing called a HIPAA law, which prohibits your employer from either discriminating against you or from making your health information public. And whoever ended up releasing it, whether it was just a reporter who got his hands on it or a team doctor, whatever it might be, definitely violated HIPAA laws. And that's obviously That's a crime, is what that is.
Mhm.
But it does already throw a wrench into a return to a season that already looked like was going to be difficult for the NFL. And that they didn't release exactly how many players from what I saw. And from what I saw, Ezekiel Elliott was the only one to be confirmed of the players. But to come back right away and already have several players on two different organizations come back testing COVID-19 positive, I don't know. That makes it difficult. That makes it difficult for me to imagine that NFL is going to get into practices anytime soon.
Well, me and you talked about this, Brady, too. It was like, what's a similarity between these two teams? They're both in Texas, and Texas was one of the first states to reopen, and they reopened way earlier than anybody else.
And then they had their highest amount of reported cases.
And then they had the highest, and so like, as much as we want to think of these players as being like in these mansions, isolating themselves, taking precautions, things like this, accidents happen. You get in contact with a person that might have it, and you don't know. And then we have to take this and then as a teams, you are going to be traveling all the time. You're going to be working with people all the time. In football, you're contacting people all the time. So the fact that these players already have COVID-19 before any of that started, I agree with you, Brady. The idea of what the NFL has to do and how they're going to combat this, I don't know, because the NFL consistently disappoints on a lot of different things, and I don't see a reason why they wouldn't disappoint here too.
Yeah, I think this is a really bad look for the NFL and especially the Dallas Cowboys
And the
because
Houston
it's just
Texans. They were
yeah,
both, yeah.
yeah, the Houston Texans too, but I think mainly the Cowboys to get to my point. Because it just reflects poorly that the players aren't really taking this seriously. And I know you guys were saying like, oh, it could have been an accident, but I think we all forgot that. I don't remember the timeline a couple weeks ago, a couple months ago, that Dak and Zeke were throwing huge ass parties during the quarantine. So
They were. And then even if we talk about some of the workouts, like Sam Darnold set up a workout in South Florida that had Saquon Barkley there and also had Kyle Allen, a backup quarterback for Washington. If those guys come back with it, now you're talking about three more franchises affected. Washington, the Jets, and the Giants. Like, the NFL is going to have to walk a very fine line. And with states opening at their own levels, some states like, Wisconsin reopened and Texas reopened and Florida reopened and some states like that. And then other states like California and New York that are still taking it very seriously. The responsibility has to be on these players because the NFL can do everything they can. The NFL can test guys as much as they want, but if the players aren't taking this seriously, if the players aren't doing their best, then there is no return to the NFL. Unfortunately, it's not going to happen. The NFL did come out and say that they were going to, I believe, test players either every day or every other day. Every other day or every 2 days, like a day and then 2 days off and then testing again. And if anybody tested positive, they were removed. The whole team was at that point tested. And they're not just testing players. They're testing faculty, they're testing staff, they're testing medical trainers, they're testing ball boys, they're testing the whole 9 yards here in order to do this. And I don't know. It remains to be seen. We're going to see how it is, and hopefully we're going to see how hopefully no other players come back testing positive. There's been a few. I know a guy with the Rams tested positive. There's been a couple. The guy who tested positive with the Rams was a while ago. There's been a couple. Say that again.
Well, like even we're thinking about like this, it's like how many players before they do their cuts, because they cut to 55 players, right? At the beginning
53.
of the season, like that's
53.
53. Okay, so 53 times 32 is 600 players, right? That's 600 players, and that's just the players at the beginning of the season. When we're talking about the almost thousands of players that are going to be a part of these, almost 1,000 players part of the NFL before we get to cuts, it's bound to happen.
I think teams can walk in with around 75. And then they can have, I believe now after the last agreement, I think it's 13 practice squad players instead of the previous 11 or something like that. So you're talking about a lot of guys coming and going from different places.
So it's bound to happen. But
this is almost where like the Green Bay Packers going to St. Norbert's College for OTAs is almost a positive because you can isolate up there. Like it's just faculty and it's just staff and everybody's staying in dorm rooms. And then when you get other organizations like Dallas who do it all at their own private practice facility, but the players can still go home, man, that just throws wrenches in it. And so I think we're going to find a situation where there may be some teams heading into possible preseason games that are still massively affected by the virus and could throw a huge wrench into their whole system. But preseason doesn't officially start for another 2 months. Regular season not for another 3. So we'll see how it goes. We're coming to the deadline here, though. The NFL has to get it together. But let's talk about the team that is meant the headliner of episode 13 here, the Detroit Lions. The Detroit Lions, consistently the disappointment of the NFC North. They went 3-12-1 last year. They lost their final 9 games. Matthew Stafford, their starting quarterback, got hurt week 9. Previous to that, he broke his back, which is ridiculous. Previous to that, he had thrown 2,499 yards, 19 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. Detroit was at one point 2-0 or 2-1-1 before a tough loss to Green Bay. After that, they only ended up winning 1 more game. They went 0-6 in division. The Matt Patricia tenure does not look good for Detroit right now. Consistently underperforming and consistently signing primarily Patriots castoffs, just like the Miami Dolphins do. Except the difference is that I think Brian Flores is a better coach than Matt Patricia is, as well as I think that the Dolphins organization is a lot more put together than the Lions is. We'll pose the question, where do you guys put Detroit? In or in need of a rebuild, in or in need of a reload, 8-8 playoff caliber or Super Bowl caliber?
Oh boy. I hate to say it, but I think you got to do a rebuild. You're looking at Matt Stafford, who we just said came off of breaking his back, and he's getting up there in age. So you got to think about the heir apparent sometime soon. And looking at this team, I think there's maybe Kenny Galladay is like the only like true franchise player that I would want to build around. Otherwise, everybody else is kind of could live without. So I think they're closer to a rebuild than contending for anything.
Yeah, I kind of have to agree. I think that, like, as much as I think Matt Stafford has been an underrated quarterback for the majority of his career at Detroit, and it's just been extenuating circumstances of bad coaches, bad defenses, bad whatever. I think that it's time to look for another new head coach. I think they need a new GM. I think that they're somewhere in between a reload and a rebuild. And it just, again, it depends on Matt Stafford's health, like you guys said. I don't see a lot of, as much as I think they have some good young players, nobody to build a team around. But yeah, I think they're much closer to a rebuild than anything else.
Yeah, I agree. And I feel bad for Matt Stafford because this is going to be his 4th rebuild that he's had to go through while being in Detroit. This is a Detroit organization that has unfortunately ruined the careers of 2 Hall of Famers in Barry Sanders and Calvin Johnson. And I think we can all agree that Calvin Johnson, even right before he retired, was probably the most dominant receiver the NFL had seen since the likes of young Randy Moss. Maybe even more dominant. Calvin Johnson was a wrecking machine of a player. Detroit has not won a playoff game since January 5th of 1992, when they beat the Dallas Cowboys in the divisional round of the playoffs. Since then, they've had to watch the Vikings go to multiple NFC championship games. The Bears not only go to multiple NFC championship games, but also make a Super Bowl appearance. Green Bay go to, I think, 6 NFC championship games, go to 3 Super Bowls, and win 2 of them since 1992. In fact, they've also got to see former division rival, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, win a Super Bowl as well. Other teams to go to their conference championship game since Detroit has, the Jacksonville Jaguars, multiple times. The New York Jets, multiple times. The Chargers, multiple times. And that's just to name a few. Detroit, unfortunately, is desperately in need of a rebuild because Detroit falls into a tier similar to Jacksonville and Cleveland as organizations that historically have no idea what the fuck they're doing. None. Like, I can't look at Bob Quinn, I can't look at this organization and figure out what the pathway is. Because I get Matt Patricia talking about the Patriot way, but then you trade Darius Slay and Quadre Diggs for next to nothing, only to spend your third overall pick on a corner as well. Now imagine had they kept both of them and then also drafted Jeff Okudah. And then Detroit looks 10 times better. You sign Green Bay Packer cast off TJ Lang, doesn't produce for you. Danny Amendola doesn't really produce for you. Really, none of the players they signed these last couple of years have produced for them. And it's sad because of all the teams in the NFC North that I hate Detroit the least. And I think it's just because I have like pity on them because they've been so unsuccessful for so long. So Detroit is desperately in need of a rebuild, and I'm going to make a prediction right now. Matthew Stafford will no longer be playing for the Lions before Aaron Rodgers will no longer be playing for the Packers. Whether that means retirement or whether that means releasing or trading, I don't know. But the other thing you have to consider with Matthew Stafford is that it's not only his health you have to consider. Remember, his wife had a very scary health situation going into this season as well. And I think that it takes a lot out of a player to stay around an organization as historically bad as the Detroit Lions are. Let's move into some of their free agent losses. Now, we already talked about Quadre Diggs, who they traded to Seattle midseason. They traded Darius Slay, the corner, to Philadelphia. He had 46 tackles, 2 interceptions, a fumble recovery, and 13 passes defense. He was responsible for 75.2% of their defensive snaps. They lost right tackle Ricky Wagner to Green Bay. He played 12 games in 2019. He played 40 games in his 3 seasons at Detroit. They lost linebacker Devon Kennard, who we talked about going to Arizona. We talked about him in the Arizona episode. He was responsible for 58 tackles, 7 sacks, 1 forced fumble, and 2 fumble recoveries. He was responsible for 82% of their defensive snaps. They lose center Graham Glasgow to Denver, who we talked about in the previous episode. He started 58 games in 4 seasons at Denver. They lost one of their backup running backs / wide receivers, J.D. McKissick, to Washington. He had 205 rushing yards and 223 receiving yards. And they also lost their other corner, Rashawn Melvin, who was responsible for 76.1% of their defensive snaps. He went to Jacksonville. He was responsible for 68 tackles and 11 passes defensed. Looking at this, the startling thing that comes out to me is Detroit lost their starting center and their starting right tackle for a quarterback who's coming off of a broken back.
Yeah, I think you got to look at both lines when it comes to free agent losses. Like you said, Graham Glasgow, their starting center, Ricky Wagner, their right tackle. And I don't know, like with the injury-prone Matthew Stafford, it's kind of hope and prayer that the offensive line kind of gels together and they get some solid play. And then you flip to the other side, they lose Snacks Harrison, their best defensive lineman player and one of the better run defensive players. He's gone. Mike Daniels is gone. Even though he did get injured for most of the year, he was still, a solid starter and depth at least. And then Ashawn Robinson left for the Rams. So now you're losing 3 defensive tackles on a defensive line that has been a former shell of itself since the Sue and Farley days. And then Devon Kennard, I think, was a really underrated linebacker for them. And he was probably one of their better ones. And that's, I think, is going to hurt them a bit. And then obviously losing their best defensive player in Darius Slay. And like you said, it would have been cool to see Darius Slay, Jeff Okudah, playing together. And they would be a lot better team, and I'd feel a little more confident in them. And then for whatever reason, they cut Sam Martin, their punter, who is like top 10, top 5, in my opinion, for punting for whatever reason. So now your special teams is going down a little bit. So I think they took some big losses that I don't think gets talked about a lot.
Yeah, I kind of have to, like, the point that I have to look at is their secondary. Like, I mean, we talk about Darius Slay, we're talking about all of that. As much as I like to think that the NFC North is a running heavy division, it's not. I mean, they have all the other 3 teams. I mean, even Detroit to a certain extent with Kenyon Johnson, is that his name? The running back from Auburn.
Oh, Kerryon Johnson.
Kerryon Johnson, thank you. Like, they have versatile running backs, but it's all four teams rely heavily on quarterback play as much as the NFL usually does. But like, that you can't hide behind a running back in this division. So like you losing all your secondary when you have Matthew Stafford, Kirk Cousins, either Mitchell Trubisky or Nick Foles, and then Aaron Rodgers in that division, and you just lost what you're talking about, players that were responsible for almost 3/4 of the snaps on your team. Like that's a lot of veterans to lose on a defense that already was underperforming. So it's like I agree with you, Brady, when you say like they're the team in the NFC North I hate the least. I pity them. I want Detroit to do well. Like Detroit as a city deserves some like good things to happen, but like the organization just lets down all the time, and they don't have an identity, and they haven't since the '90s, and it's really sad.
It is, and it's even worse to think about them firing Jim Caldwell because 9-7 wasn't good enough, and then you replace it with 3-12-1, and yeah, I get it. Detroit, you can hide behind the fact that Matt Stafford broke his back, but Matt Stafford broke his back week 9. By week 9, you guys were already 3-6-1, I believe. Like your season was already over by the time he went out. Like, yeah, defensively, you had a great game against Kansas City. And then you lost of your 2 corners, 3/4 of your snap, and of your starting linebacker, 4/5 of all your snaps. Sucks. And we'll get to who they replace it with, and unfortunately, they don't replace it well. When he's playing at his peak, Matt Stafford is the second best quarterback in the division. And I would argue that the Lions probably have the best receiving group in the division. Kenny Golladay is a stud. Love Kenny Golladay. I think he matches up against anybody. To me, he's on par with Devontae Adams in terms of route running ability and speed and matchup nightmares. He just doesn't get the respect on his name because he plays for Detroit. The fact that Kenny Golladay had 11 of the team's 28 receiving touchdowns last year with guys like David Blau starting at quarterback is ridiculous. The fact that even without Matt Stafford, he still put up nearly 1,200 receiving yards, he doesn't get enough respect. It's just that offensive line. Graham Glasgow wasn't a great center. He's not fantastic. Ricky Wagner wasn't a fantastic right tackle. But when you lose that is so difficult to come back from. And when we get to their draft, they don't address it very well, and they also don't draft very well. Sorry. But let's move into some of their pickups. They pick up Desmond Trufant, the corner from Atlanta, who in 9 games last year had 18 tackles, 7 passes defensed, and 4 interceptions. They pick up corner Darryl Roberts from the Jets, who had 63 tackles, an interception, and 6 passes defensed. They trade for safety Duron Harmon from New England, who had 2 interceptions last year. They pick up former Green Bay Packer wide receiver Geronimo Allison, who had 287 yards on 34 catches and 2 touchdowns. Biggest pickup was probably Jamie Collins, the outside linebacker from New England, who last year recorded 7 sacks, 3 interceptions, 3 forced fumbles, and 1 fumble recovery. Other notable pickups, Danny Shelton, the former defensive tackle from New England, former first-round pick of the Cleveland Browns, who had 61 tackles, 3 sacks, a forced fumble, and I've been practicing this, Halapuli Vete Vaitai, the right tackle from Philadelphia, who only started 4 games in the last 2 seasons, is now going to be your starting right tackle. He was only responsible for 40.6% of Philadelphia's offensive snaps. How do you guys grade their free agent pickups?
Taking a look at it, maybe a C-. I do like the Danny Shelton signing. I think that he kind of boosted his stock playing in New England, because in Cleveland he was kind of looking like a bust, but I think he built up some stock, and hopefully he can kind of continue that momentum on the Detroit's defensive line, which they desperately need. I like the pickup of Chase Daniel. I think he'll be an excellent backup, and as we've said it before, with Matt Stafford coming off a broken back, you definitely need a surefire thing behind him. Desmond Trufant, I think he's a good corner. Obviously, he's no Darius Slay, but I think he'll help a little bit. I think Hal Vitae, I think that was an overpay. We're talking about a guy who's mostly been a swing tackle and only has a handful of starts, and you're going to put him as a starter and then, back up the Brinks truck for him. I think that was a fail. Gmo, I think was once a promising guy, but after he got injured, he's kind of a shell of himself. So I think that was a bad signing. And then Duron Harmon, I think, was, okay. I think it gives you some good depth in that secondary, which they desperately need. So I think a couple pickups that make it a higher grade than it really should be. So the best I can do is a C-.
I'm. I think I think that their best pickup was Jamie Collins. Like that's just my, as a Patriot fan, like knowing who they picked up from the Patriots, and I mean I kind of agree. I think and like the only other player that kind of was on my radar was Desmond Trufant. I agree with you. I think he's a nice defensive back. He had some pretty good. He had a good season with Atlanta. In the past. But like Darren Harmon is a defensive back, but he's kind of past his prime. That's why Bill Belichick was comfortable enough replacing him with a Division II player. I think that Jamie Collins, I was mad that the Patriots let Jamie Collins walk because I thought that he was a really good piece on our defense this last year. And I think that he will do good in Detroit as opposed to what he did in Cleveland, because he's from everything I saw, he's matured as a player. He's better. Danny Shelton, he did some good things with New England, but again, I don't think he's the piece that they need. I think they got him for a good price, but he's not what they need. Especially when you're replacing as many snaps as you did. It's just, again, like they hit on one of 3 players from New England, and that's just it. This offseason was indicative of almost every offseason that Matt Patricia has been there, picking names that are kind of known by Patriots fans and not really anybody else. And then picking up some other players, either overpaying for players like Vaitai or just picking up cast-offs. I give it a C- because it's like I like the Jamie Collins. I like Desmond Trufant. I kind of respect Harmon, but they need to stop. They need to stop with the Patriots cast-offs because it's not doing anything for them.
No, I mean, I agree completely. The best I can do on this is a C. And the reason it's a C that could go up to a B.
Wow.
Only if they get the same level of production out of these players as they got. Now, Desmond Trufant only played in 9 games last season, but he had a career high 4 interceptions in that season. If they get that production out of him, he's great. In his first 7 seasons in the league, he's played at least 15 games 5 times. The other 2, he's had 2 seasons in 2016 as well as in 2019 where, due to injuries, he only played 9 games. But 4 interceptions, huge. They got serviceable backups at the corner position, guys who can do okay. But when this is a division that you have to play Allen Robinson, you have to play Devontae Adams, you have to play Adam Thielen, unfortunately, an aging Desmond Trufant and an aging Darryl Roberts isn't going to get it cut. And now you can talk about whether you agree with it or not. The tight end position all across the NFC North got better. Like if Jay Sternberger can play to his level, okay, that's good. Kyle Rudolph, still a stud. Cole Kmet, I think, as we talked about in the Bears, I think he can seriously produce really well. But the Lions didn't address anything from it. Jamie Collins, yeah, if you can get 7 sacks and 3 interceptions out of Jamie Collins, that's great. But who else is there in Detroit to produce a pass rush? Not really anybody. Trey Flowers didn't produce last season the way that they wanted him to. So what makes me think that Jamie Collins is going to produce any better? I like the Danny Shelton pick, and I agree with you completely. The Vaitai pick is a Band-Aid on a bleeding wound. Like it doesn't – he's a swing player. 4 games started in the last 2 seasons in Philadelphia. He only played 40% of their snaps, and that's including the fact that Lane Johnson has had suspension and injury issues. I don't like it. It has the possibility to go to a B, but it also has the possibility to go to an F if those guys can't produce. So that's why I think a C is rather fair. Let's move on to their draft. Now, Detroit had, I believe, 9 draft picks, if I'm looking at this correctly. 1 second, I got to count.
Yeah, 9.
9 draft picks. We're going to go through the list, and then we're going to grade it. The 3rd overall pick, they drafted Jeff Okudah. the corner out of Ohio State University. I think the best corner in the NFL draft this season. 34 tackles, 3 interceptions, 9 passes defensed. In the second round, pick 35, they drafted DeAndre Swift, halfback out of Georgia. 196 carries, 1,218 yards, 7 touchdowns. Third round, they drafted Julian Okara, edge rusher out of Notre Dame, 19 tackles, 5 sacks, 2 forced fumbles. In the third round, their 75th overall pick, Jonah Jackson, guard out of Ohio State. Fourth round, they went Logan Stenberg, guard out of Kentucky. Fifth round, they drafted Quintez Cephas, wide receiver from Wisconsin, who had 901 receiving yards and 7 touchdowns last year. Other fifth-round pick, they went Jason Huntley, running back out of New Mexico State, who had 1,090 yards and 9 touchdowns. Sixth round, they went John Pennicini, defensive tackle out of Utah, who had 2 sacks and 2 forced fumbles. And in the seventh round, they drafted Jayshon Cornell, defensive tackle out of Ohio State, 4 sacks and 1 forced fumble in 2019. How do you guys grade the Detroit draft class?
I'm going to have to give this draft class a C+. There's some guys I really like in this class. Jeff Okudah, I agree with you, Brady. I think he was the best corner coming into this draft class. I think he's going to be obviously a day one starter, and I think, he's going to prove that he deserved that 3rd overall spot. But on a kind of another note about it, I'm excited to see what his teammate Shaun Wade's going to do next year in Ohio State and see who was kind of better. But anyways, I do like the Swift pick. I think him and Kerryon Johnson are going to be a nice little tandem that could really give a boost to this offense, especially the running game, which they're before Kerryon Johnson, their best running back was Reggie Bush. I think it was cool that they hooked up Julian and Romeo, 2 brothers on the same team. Always love that. I think Jonah Jackson and Logan Sternberger are, 2 depth kind of picks. Obviously, they could go either way, so there's kind of that unknown factor. Obviously, I'm going to root for Quintez Cephas. The dude's been through a lot of shit, and I think he's come out on top of it, and I truly believe that he has the potential to be that 3rd wide receiver behind Marvin Jones and Kenny Golladay. So I'm hoping all the best for him in Detroit. And then the last 3 picks are just kind of So the best I can do is a C+.
I go C-. I agree that a lot of these players have potential or they're filling some depth. I agree that Jeff Okudah was their best pickup. Because he was a shutdown. He was just the best corner on the board. Well, probably one of the best players on the board, in my opinion. DeAndre Swift, I have between the 3 running backs from Georgia that have come out, Nick Chubb, Sony Michel, and DeAndre Swift. I think of the 3, Sony Michel was the most underrated and DeAndre Swift was the most overrated. I mean, he did produce at Georgia. I agree he produced at Georgia. He did very well there. But he never seemed to live up to the hype. He was always supposed to be touted as one of the best running backs in college football that could continuously produce, but and multiple times he just seemed to stall and not do what he needed to do. In my opinion, I mean, I could completely be wrong there. Julian, I like Julian's. I like that pick. I think that the Notre Dame, he did well at Notre Dame. I think he can build to a good player, but that just depends on what kind of coaching environment he has, which I don't know if he can get that from Detroit. I agree with the O-line picks. They're just depth positions that could potentially, again, be good starters, but who knows. Quintez Cephas, as a Nebraska fan, I never understood how Quintez Cephas could always find a way to be open no matter who was throwing the ball to him. Quintez Cephas, he had no right to be as good as he was, and he was great. And I have a lot of respect for Quintez Cephas because I think that he's a good player. He just seemed like the right player, and I think he could do well. I agree. I think he could be a nice 3rd in Detroit. I like Utah defensive players in general, so I did think that John Pacini could be good. But I think it's similar to Okura, where it's the environment needs to suit, and I don't know if he'll have that. I'd also just like to point out that it went Jason, John, and then Jayshon. I think that's funny that they did that. Just in my opinion, I think that's funny. But like I said, they didn't need another running back.
Who knows? With the way that Detroit picks, it may have just only made those guys the selections.
They might have picked it exactly that way. So we got Jason, we got a John. There's a Jay Sean.
There's a Jay Sean, yeah.
I do. The one I have to highlight though is Jason Huntley. Like, he was a running back. They didn't need any more running backs. There were other players they could have maybe gotten some more defensive line depth there, like filled those holes that they needed, or some offensive line players in round 5. There were still some good players there, and they chose not to. And they chose to get another running back because that just seems like what they want. They want players that are flashy. But again, even then, Jason Huntley is 5'9". He's an undersized running back in today's NFL. And whether or not he can produce, it's another question.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. It is kind of another question there. I'm going to give Detroit a C+. The reason is that there's a few picks that I absolutely adore, and there's a few picks that make no sense to me. The Jeff Okudah pick, he was hands down the best corner available. This is a guy who didn't have a single penalty called against him. He played amazing. He was a large reason Ohio State had the success that they did, especially against high-flying teams like Penn State and even Clemson in the game that they played him against. He had a fantastic game. The other pick that I give them a big A+ on is actually the Jonah Jackson pick out of Ohio State. A lot of people slept on this guy. He's got the length. He's got the girth of a guard that you want. He's got good arms. He doesn't get caught flat-footed. Unfortunately, Logan Stenberg, the guard they drafted right after him in Kentucky, his issue is that he has all the things as well, but he gets caught flat-footed all the time. Jonah Jackson is a great pick to me. My issue is that I don't know if guard was where Detroit really needed to go. I don't know if that's the pick that they needed. And even if we move on to their second-round pick, DeAndre Swift, I don't know if halfback was what Detroit needed. Like, if we look at who was available when they picked DeAndre Swift in terms of offensive line help, Robert Hunt out of Louisiana, really good guard who ended up going to Miami. We go down the list. We talked about him in the previous one. Ezra Cleveland went to Minnesota. He was available. I don't know if he was worth the 35th overall pick, but if he's in at guard opposed to Vaitai, I feel a little bit more confident in who the Lions look like as a team. I don't think they needed a halfback. And in fact, I would have liked to see Detroit draft a halfback, or even we talked about it, Matt Hennessy, the center, in the second round, draft him. And then in the 5th round, go to Jason Huntley. Because I think Jason Huntley is secretly a really good back. Let's compare stats. DeAndre Swift, 196 carries, 1,218 yards, 7 touchdowns. Jason Huntley, 154 carries, 1,090 yards, 9 touchdowns. So in 42 fewer carries, he only had 128 less yards, about 3 yards a carry, and 2 more touchdowns. Now I know, the competition New Mexico State plays versus the competition Georgia plays are 2 completely different things. But did you really need DeAndre Swift? Understanding the patchwork of an offensive line you have, and understanding that Detroit doesn't know how to utilize halfbacks very well, and the fact that they got good production out of other guys like Bo Scarborough last year, did you really need DeAndre Swift? It didn't seem like the right pick to me. I feel like we've hammered home the Utah defenders. I think Utah had maybe the best all-around defense last year that nobody talked about, so I like the John Pennicini pick. Okwara is hit or miss. He showed really good flashes at Notre Dame, but he only had 18 tackles the entire season. Notre Dame played 13 games. He had 18 tackles. That's not acceptable, even if for an edge rusher. Like, that's absolutely not acceptable. So I can give it a C. With Quintez Cephas, I'll agree with Skylar. I think that he was maybe the slowest looking wide receiver who put up 900 yards in college football history. And maybe it's just because he wore white pants, because when you wear white, it makes you run slower. Like, who knows? But, like, I don't understand how this guy got as open as he did. And that catch that he had against Ohio State to end the half in the Big Ten championship game is a really underrated catch. And it's massively underrated because Wisconsin lost that game. But he had a great catch there where Ohio State scores, Wisconsin needs to score to stay up big in the first half. And he comes down with a great catch and ends up in the end zone. And it's fantastic. Detroit.
Like I say,
go ahead.
Well, like Quinton, like just going off that again, like building like players who are like at the right positions, getting in the right places. Like as a Nebraska fan, like the Davis brothers were both still available in round 5. And I feel like they were defensive tackle, defensive end hybrids. And I can't remember which one was Khalil or Carlos, but he had 8.5 sacks in the Big Ten. And had one of the fastest. They both had some of the fastest combines of 300-pound players ever. So in those, and I think that Pittsburgh and Tampa Bay were very smart to pick them both up. I think that that just shows the difference in knowing what you kind of need in your organization, where it's kind of like again, do you need another running back in round 2 with the 3rd overall pick in round 2? Do you, when you have the slew of offensive talent that you have? Even if you don't want to get an offensive lineman, there's plenty of defensive backs that you could have picked up, plenty of linebackers you could have picked up. Because Queen was already gone. He went to Baltimore. But there's still plenty of
Like
linebackers.
Grant Delpit was still available.
Grant Delpit was still available there.
Yeah.
You have and I'm gonna make the joke where it's coming to the point where it's like, if New England needs draft picks, you're gonna trade a player to Detroit. That's just what it is. That's what it is, because Detroit doesn't, even if Detroit doesn't know what to do with the players you give them, and they don't know what to do with the draft picks that you give them, unless it's really obvious in their face. I would agree though that Jonah Jackson was an underrated player.
Yeah, Jonah Jackson, I think he's going to end up at starting guard. If you look at their guards, you're talking about Joe Dahl, who was a 5th-round pick, and then you're talking about Ode Ibushi, who was an undrafted free agent out of Arizona. I think Jonah Jackson ends up taking that guard position. But even then, it's just the Detroit offensive line looks piecemeal at best. I've said it a few times here. I think of all of the Bill Belichick disciples to end up being head coaches, Matt Patricia was the least ready to be a head coach. At least Brian Flores, I could argue that he was the linebacker coach. He made his way up through the system. He seemed ready. But Matt Patricia, and I guess the game that I just go back to is that blowout to Kansas City a few seasons ago where, yeah, I know, New England ended up winning the Super Bowl. Their defense picked up. But there was no reason for them to get blown out by Kansas City. And unfortunately, a lot of the times in the last couple of seasons that Matt Patricia was the defensive coordinator, there was a lot of times where defensively the Patriots looked lost. And I think the only reason Matt Patricia got a head coaching job is maybe because Bill Belichick is secretly the best defensive coordinator the NFL has ever known.
Thank you.
Keep in mind that Bill Belichick won 2 Super Bowls as a defensive coordinator with the Giants in the 80s, coaching guys like Lawrence Taylor. One reason, and I always give Bill Belichick credit for it, one reason Bill Belichick is maybe the best offensive mind in the NFL is because he knows defense so well. And unfortunately with Matt Patricia, I don't think that that's the case.
Well, and something I have to point out as being a Patriot fan, where it's like our defense is always good. Like our defense, I'll say there were spots between 2007 and 2004 where it was a little
14.
Like when we lost 14. Sorry, thank you. Where we lost Bruschi, we lost Asante Samuel, where we lost these players, and we were like, who's going to step up? Because we didn't know what was going to do. But even then, we still had a mid-tier defense in the NFL, where it's like it could be Matt Patricia, it can be Brian Flores, it can be Steve Belichick, because that's his son, who apparently was calling our defensive plays last year. Where it's like, I agree. I think that, and another thing Bill Belichick does so well that I think other people need to learn is that he delegates when he needs to.
Yeah.
And I think that when you're looking at the sideline, when Brian Flores and Steven Belichick were calling the defenses these last 2 years, Bill Belichick, you very rarely saw Bill Belichick over there with him talking about what to do with defensive schemes. When Matt Patricia was there, he was consistently by Matt Patricia, consistently talking about defensive schemes, consistently talking to defensive players. I agree. I think Matt Patricia would, because it felt like he had to be. And you know what? Maybe this could be a Matt what happens with McDaniels, where it's like McDaniels went away, did horrible with Denver, comes back and becomes more ready. And I honestly think he's going to be the next Patriot head coach. That's just my opinion. Or it can be what happened, or you can just stay away like
the first time.
And I don't think Matt Patricia has, like, he says Patriot way, but the only reason, but even Bill Belichick's like, we don't have a way. I just coach the team how I want them to be.
Yeah.
Where it's like, and that's, you can't replicate Belichick. You just can't.
Yeah, and the other thing I'd just like to point out, just to add misery to Detroit fans, is that the year that they hired Matt Patricia, one Kyle Shanahan was available to be his head coach. Now imagine what Detroit looks like if Kyle Shanahan is their head coach. So
Exactly.
let's hop into their season. We've talked about Detroit a few times here in regards to Arizona and Carolina and Chicago and a few other times. Go back and listen to those episodes. But week 1, they host the Chicago Bears. I have them losing this game. We already talked about the massive questions they have on the offensive line. I think Khalil Mack and Robert Quinn and Akeem Hicks live in the backfield that day. Detroit loses that game, and maybe Matthew Stafford re-breaks his back. Who knows?
I have the Detroit Lions coming out the gate winning. I just think that the Bears have a few more questions than the Lions for me, at least, just because of the quarterback play, like who's going to be playing. And I really don't like either option for the Bears, and I think that could hinder their offense. And with really Allen Robinson being their only like receiving threat, because they really have nobody at the tight end position. I know they just drafted Cole Kmet, but he's a rookie, and it takes time for rookie tight ends to develop. So it's going to be a while before we see his potential. So I just think that Detroit has more eggs in their basket than the Bears do, so I think they'll get the win.
I agree with Brady here, honestly. I think that I had Chicago winning this first game coming out when we did the Chicago episode, and I have Chicago winning this game again because whether or not it's Mitchell
Well, good.
Trubisky.
Thank you for being consistent with it.
Thank you. But like whether Mitchell Trubisky or Nick Foles starts the game, I think that their defense, especially with the only like I view it polar opposites. The Chicago Bears offense, you can do different things, but we have no idea who their quarterback's going to be. The Detroit Lions offense, we know who their quarterback's going to be, but the rest of the offense is just what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And I happen to trust more of the Chicago Bears offense than either side of Detroit.
Yeah, I mean, I would just like to point out that Detroit's been beat by Chase Daniels at quarterback for Chicago, so I don't necessarily know if it matters as long as the defense is there. But I respect your pick, Mitch. Moving on to week 2, Detroit goes to Green Bay. Now, Detroit was not trailing against Green Bay in either of their matchups until the very last moment of each game. They ended up getting swept by Green Bay. I've said it a few times on the episodes. For a rebuilding team to have success, they have to win in division. And this is a game where Detroit doesn't do that. Way too many questions. We're going to go back to the offensive line. Green Bay had an underrated pass rush. Yeah, I get it. The linebacker position has some questions, but I think the secondary is just as good as it was. And I think offensively, Green Bay is going to be a little bit more put together. Green Bay beats Detroit week 2.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the Packers are going to beat the Lions. I know the Lions kind of had our number the past couple of years, but I think with Matt LaFleur running the ship and just some of the acquisitions we've made, I think we're a better team than what we were when the Detroit was beating us. So I think we're going to put a stop to that. I don't think their offense is good enough to compete with our defense, even though there is some questions with the front seven. I still think it's solid enough with Kenny Clark kind of leading the defensive line, and hopefully the Smith brothers kind of hopefully shoring up that linebacker position that will be able to take on an offense what Detroit has. And I think that with the just massive holes on the Detroit's defensive line, I think Aaron Jones is going to have a field day, and it's going to be fun to watch Devontae Adams have his way with Jeff Okudah and giving him his welcome to the NFL moment.
Yeah, I think it kind of sucks for Detroit to play the teams in the NFC North at the same time, or a week after week, back to back. That's what I meant to say. But again, it's when you're going up against Aaron and then you replace all of your defensive backfield basically with patchmark different players, rookies, people past their prime, injury-prone players. Aaron Rodgers is looking at the defensive backfield and going, ha, he's going to have a field day. Matt LaFleur is a good coach. Green Bay wins.
All right, all in agreement there. Week 3 matchup we talked about in the very first episode that we did breaking these teams down, the Arizona Cardinals. I have Arizona winning this game. I think Arizona is going to take a big leap offensively. Again, Detroit's massive question marks defensively in the backfield and the linebacker position in terms of a pass rush is going to lead to too many things. And I think Arizona has a better defense than people give them credit for. Detroit starts out 0-3 with a loss in the desert to the Cardinals.
I think the Detroit Lions are going to get a win, mainly because of questions I have with the Cardinals more than the Detroit Lions being better, if that makes sense. I just think that it's going to take Arizona a while to kind of hit that peak of like what we think they could be. And then just some of the questions that I have for them on defense, with mainly being Chandler Jones and Patrick Peterson kind of leading the charge, and a lot of questions at various positions. And then I just kind of wonder how the offensive line is going to hold up. It hasn't been what it's used to be, but I think it's getting, better. But I still have some questions with it, and I think Detroit's going to get a second win right here.
I have Arizona winning this game because even if I have questions, the answers I have from Detroit aren't good answers. Because, I don't have questions on whether or not their secondary is going to be good because it's not going to be good. I don't have questions on whether or not their offensive line is going to be good because it's not going to be good. Also facing up against Hopkins and Fitzgerald with the dynamic quarterback that is holy shit, I just forgot his name.
Kyler Murray.
Thank you, Kyle Murray. It's Arizona is, I believe, is one of the best teams improved from last season to this season, and as much as they're not going to improve drastically. Last year's team was still better than last year's Detroit team, and they just improved. So Arizona wins.
All right, Week 4 matchup. They host the New Orleans Saints. This is just an easy win for the Saints. New Orleans has way too many weapons offensively and defensively. They added guys like Malcolm Jenkins in the secondary. The Saints win. I think Drew Brees has a field day against Matt Patricia, and I think that this, because I have them starting 0-4, this may be one of the points where Detroit fans call for the firing of Matt Patricia, because I think this is going to be like a 45-17 blowout.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the Saints are going to blow the Lions out, and I think this loss is going to add gasoline to that hot seat that Matt Patricia is currently sitting on. I just think that the Saints are superior in every way when it comes to every position on the team, and they're going to show that.
Yeah, New Orleans is one of my favorites to win the Super Bowl. So it's not even a question about whether or not they tear apart this team. I mean, Drew Brees is, I believe, is the second best quarterback in the NFL right now. And I think that he just tear this defensive backfield apart.
Well, it's an interesting point there, Skylar, and we'll talk about it when we get to the New Orleans
Brady,
episode.
Brees, Rodgers. Brady, Brees, Rodgers.
So
That's not even my top three.
So Pat Mahomes isn't even in your top three?
Wow.
I think. Well, I'm gonna go off of generations. If I'm gonna go if I'm gonna go this generation, it's Brady, Brees, Rodgers. If I'm gonna go the next generation, it's Mahomes, Jackson, and then the third spot's a little up for grabs. I think Patrick Mahomes
Watson.
and Lamar Jackson, not this season. Say that
Sean
again.
Watson is what he said.
Watson.
Watson. I think that not this season, but next season, you're going to see Lamar Jackson and Patrick Mahomes be they're top 5 quarterbacks, but I think they're going to officially surpass this last generation.
I don't know. I mean, I would put Rodgers over Brees, and not just because I'm a Packer fan, but I'd put Rodgers over Brees largely based off of playoff success, because at least Rodgers has won playoff games the last couple of years. Brees hasn't. But it's an argument we can get to another day. So heading into their bye week, they have a Week 5 bye. Skylar, you and me both have Detroit starting 0-4. Mitch, you have them at 2-2. Coming out of their bye, they go to Jacksonville to play the Jaguars. This is an easy win for me. Jacksonville has way too many questions. They traded a lot of their best defensive players. I think secretly they had a pretty good offseason in terms of signings. Joe Schobert, if he's completely healthy, Tyler Eifert, secretly it's good, but there's just way too many questions. They lost A.J. Bouye. They lost Jalen Ramsey. Who knows what their linebacker position is going to look like. Detroit wins that game and gets their first win of the season in my books.
Yep, everyone knows my opinion about the Jacksonville Jaguars. They're my only team who are not going to get a win at all this season. And then, I wonder where that Joe Schobert kid came from. Anyways.
Was he from Waukesha? I know he went to West.
Yep, Waukesha.
Okay, he was from Waukesha.
But, yeah, easy win for the Lions.
He's a
I'm
he's a
gonna keep a
homer,
tally.
Skyler.
I'm
He's
gonna keep a tally
homer,
how many
Skyler.
times he mentions Wisconsin players in every podcast. I'm just gonna keep a tally from now on.
He got
But,
so angry that he froze himself.
Just a little bit.
Am I frozen?
No, Skyler
No,
was.
me.
Oh,
I so secretly want Jacksonville to have a really good season because I was really happy when they did have a really good season the last couple years, but they're not. They're just not. Detroit wins. I love Gardner Minshew. I think he can do some very crazy things, but he's not a put the franchise on his shoulders kind of player. So Detroit wins the game.
Yeah, fun fact about Gardner Minshew in terms of quarterbacks last season, he actually had the second most rushing yards from scrimmage, only behind Lamar Jackson.
Which is great.
I love him. I want Jacksonville to do well. I want Gardner Minshew to do great because I love Gardner Minshew, but Jacksonville won't do well.
No quarterback has fit better.
2021.
No quarterback has fit better in a city than Gardner Minshew in Jacksonville. His aesthetic is Jacksonville aesthetic, where the jean shorts and the Fu Manchu, it just fits. But
it's that typical Northern Florida weird. I love it.
Yeah.
Week 7 matchup we talked about in the Atlanta episode. They go to Atlanta. I have them beating the Falcons. The only team in my mind who has more questions defensively than Detroit might be Atlanta, because the pass rush isn't necessarily there. The secondary isn't necessarily there. The defensive line isn't that much better. And offensively, I think they have a good offense, but I'm going to tip my hat to Detroit on this one and say that the Lions beat the Falcons.
Yeah, I think the Lions. I think the Lions are going to beat the Falcons. Even though the Falcons, in my opinion, have a better offense than the Lions, I just think that the comparison between the two defenses is just such a great gap that it's going to give the Lions the edge.
Yeah. People know my thoughts on the Falcons. And I think that after this game, the Falcons will officially be looking for a new head coach and will officially be very upset that they let Kyle Shanahan go because he was their offensive coordinator. And you know what? It's more and more becoming apparent that he was the reason why they were successful.
And why they lost.
Why they lost. But even when they lost in the Super Bowl instead of,
Yeah, he chokes in Super Bowls. He'll get you there, but he's not going to win you one.
Okay, but Detroit would love that right now.
San Francisco episode. We can't. They're way down the line here, boys. We'll talk about it when we get to San Francisco.
I think Atlanta's looking for a new head coach after this game because I think Detroit's going to win the game mainly because Atlanta just has way too many questions and I don't believe in their head coach.
Yeah, completely agree. We've been reading the last 3 picks here. Week 8 matchup, they host the Indianapolis Colts. You know my opinion on the Colts. Quentin Nelson was voted the 4th best player in the NFL this upcoming season. And according to defensive statistics, the Colts have the 7th best defense in the NFL. But we'll get onto it when we get to the Colts episode. You guys have different opinions on them than I do. I think what we can all agree is that regardless of what Phillip Rivers you get, Phillip Rivers is probably better than what Detroit is going to bring to the table. The Colts still have a really good offensive line, a pretty good run game, and defensively they're secretly good. So Detroit loses, Indianapolis wins on the road.
Yeah, I'm going to disagree with you there. I think the Lions are going to win, even though the Colts have a really great offensive line, and I don't deny that, and I like their offensive line. I just don't like their quarterback. I don't think he's reliable. When you look at their wide receiver core, it's basically T.Y. Hilton and a lot of unproven guys and some rookies. And then, Marlon Mack is a pretty solid back, and then you're bringing in Jonathan Taylor, a rookie, to come in. And tight end position, it's kind of up in the air. I mean, Jack Doyle has been kind of solid, but he's been really spotty the past few seasons. And I think with all of that and then some rookies, in this kind of offseason, they're not going to, get that full adjustment to the team and the playbook and all that kind of stuff. I think it's going to put some cracks in that armor. And then I'm just really not sold on the Colts defense yet. I think they're good, but they're not great, and I think the Detroit Lions are going to get an upset here.
See, I know in the past I've usually agreed with Mitch and attacked how
there are holes in Indianapolis, but again, they're like minor holes that can be fixed in the next couple of years. Whereas with Detroit, it's gaping holes in everywhere. I do think that Indianapolis is a much better team than they were last year. And that's why I have Indianapolis winning this game. Because I also think that Frank Reich is an underrated coach. Because what he did with Indianapolis last year after losing once-in-a-generational talent like Andrew Luck out of nowhere, I think that he does great with this team. And I think that they win.
Yeah, let's also not forget that Frank Reich is the only coach in NFL history to have a team start 1-5 and actually make the playoffs. They went 10-6 and beat Houston on the road in the playoffs. But whatever, we'll get into it. So week 9 matchup, they go to Minnesota to play the Vikings. I actually have them winning this game. I think that Detroit finds a way to play Minnesota really well. Minnesota definitely took a step back this season. Defensively, it's not necessarily there, especially on the defensive line. Secondary has questions with some of the losses. Dalvin Cook right now is holding out, and we saw how Minnesota played in the Week 16 matchup against Green Bay without Dalvin Cook. They were abysmal. Detroit wins that game at Minnesota.
I think that Detroit's going to lose this game to Minnesota. Just being with the home game, and then I think the Vikings, even though there are some big questions with that secondary, I feel like their front seven is solid enough to hold them together, especially against, Detroit Lions offense. But I still think that – wait, hold on. Whew, sorry, long day. So I think even though there are other questions, the Vikings defense is still – wait. Sorry.
You were talking about the Vikings defense front seven is still going to be good enough against who the Lions.
Oh, yeah, I have Detroit. Sorry, I forgot who I had winning. I still think the front seven is going to be good enough for this defense, and whatever the Lions offense is going to put out there, they're going to hold them. And I think even though we did see that Dalvin Cook, with him being out of the offense, it wasn't as great, but I don't think the Vikings offense needs to be prolific to, score some points on the Lions defense. So I'm going to give the Vikings the win.
Yeah, I think when you're looking at the NFC North, it's kind of like, okay, we have Chicago and Green Bay who can consistently perform well, and I think Minnesota was in that tier and then took a step back this last year. And they're now with Detroit and being like, okay, we have the potential, but are we going to live it up to it? I think that when it comes to this, I have Minnesota winning because I think that even though they lost Stephon Diggs, they still have Adam Thielen. I think Kirk Cousins is going to play consistently, which is okay. And this isn't a primetime game, so you know what? He shouldn't have a problem. I think that they did get – I love the wide receiver they picked up in the draft.
Justin Jefferson.
Thank you. I'm blanking on names today.
It happens to everybody.
I think that he fills some spots, and I think that he's quick enough, versatile enough, and I think with Adam Thielen that they can, again, tear apart the secondary and that they have nobody in, like, anywhere on this defense that I think can perform well, and they can't create a pass rush, so I have to give it to Minnesota.
All right, well, agree to disagree. So at the halfway point of their season, Skylar, you have Detroit at 2-6. I have Detroit at 3-5. Mitch, you have Detroit at 5-3. Moving on to a Week 10 matchup, they host the Washington Redskins. This, to me, is a win for Detroit. They're second in a row, as well as their fourth of last five games. Washington's defensive line is really good, but the rest of the team has massive question marks. Detroit doesn't need a good secondary because Washington doesn't have any receivers, doesn't have any tight ends, and who knows who's really playing at halfback. Is Geis going to be back? What Adrian Peterson are we going to get? Detroit wins that game against Washington.
Yeah, I agree with you. Detroit's going to get this win. Even though the Washington has a really sneaky good defense, their offense is just going to hold them back from even sniffing a win in this game. With Dwayne Haskins being the quarterback, it's such a question mark of what you're going to get. With Trent Williams officially leaving that offensive line, you're looking at Brandon Sheriff as being your only reliable starter. You only have Terry McLaughlin as your only wide receiver who's reliable enough to get you some yards. And then you have an old Adrian Peterson as your starter, and then Darius Geis coming off an injury and Bryce Love coming off an injury. So with that kind of offense, I think no matter what the state of the Detroit Lions is, they're going to get a win.
Mitch, his name is Terry McLaren. McLaughlin is like Sarah, the girl who sings the songs that make you sad when you watch pets that are neglected.
Aren't they the same person?
No, they're not. They're not, unfortunately.
I agree with both of you. I think that as much as I want Washington to be successful, they're not. I think that again, their defensive line is the best part of the team. And they'll create some kind of pass rush, but when you don't have a linebacking core to speak of, your secondary is getting questionable, and your offense is and your offense is not even there. The Detroit can win this game, and they should win this game.
All righty, so I'll agree again. Week 11 matchup, they go to Carolina. We talked about this in the Carolina game. I have them losing to Carolina. The large reason is that Carolina, I think, is probably in a little bit of a better position defensively. I know they lost some guys, but they addressed a lot of it. Their defensive line is really strong, or projected to be. And the big thing to me is, who does Detroit have to cover Christian McCaffrey? Are we going to put Jamie Collins on Christian McCaffrey? Who are you going to put on him? And Teddy Bridgewater, when he was the quarterback of the Vikings, had large success against the Lions. So Carolina wins this game. This is one of the few games I have Carolina winning.
Yeah, this is a Carolina win for me as well. I think the Lions and the Panthers are kind of similar to where their teams are as this moment, but I kind of like the Panthers team a little bit more just because of Christian McCaffrey. I think the dude's a really big game changer, and with a subpar defense like that, he's gonna eat them alive, whether he's running or catching. I think Teddy Bridgewater is a good enough quarterback to do some damage against those Lions cornerbacks. And I think that the Carolina defense is a little bit better than what Detroit has to offer, especially with that defensive line and Kawan Short and Brian Burns. So I'm going to give this to Carolina.
I have to give this one to Detroit. And the main reason is even though I do believe that Carolina is going to be going up in the next couple of years, and Detroit's going to continuously go down unless serious changes are made. I think that when you're looking at it, that Detroit's, like, Matthew Stafford is going to have a game where Matthew Stafford is a quarterback that can win some games. And I think this is one of the games that he can, because the Carolina defense is still questionable, especially losing Luke Kuechly and some of their other key players on that defense. I'm not sold on them being able to have a pass rush. And like we said, like Brady, you said, they have one of the best. Detroit has one of the wide receiver cores in the NFC North, maybe the NFC in general. I think that Matthew Stafford can have a good game against Carolina and win the game.
All right. Well, agree to disagree there. Week 12 matchup, they host the Houston Texans. I have them winning this game. Houston took a sharp decline this season. The weapons on the offensive position are huge questions. I think this is going to end up being a little bit more of a shootout than anything else in terms of a defensive matchup. I just like Detroit in this matchup a little bit more. It's a little bit of a gut feeling there.
Yeah, sorry, Brady. I have Detroit beating your Texans.
I'm okay with it. The Texans are going to
fucking suck this year.
Because of some guy. I think the Texans basically come down to three players at this point as a team, and I've said it before, as Deshaun Watson, J.J. Watt, and Reed in the secondary. And besides that, you don't have a whole lot. The wide receiver core is kind of decimated with that Hopkins loss, because Will Fuller's now your wide receiver one, and he can't stay on the field, so it gets really kind of iffy at that point. We're counting on David Johnson, who's kind of gone on a downturn after having a really nice start to his career in Arizona. And then an offensive line that has been constantly being changed and so on and so forth. And I I'm not in love with the Houston defense. There's a couple good players, but as a whole, I don't believe in them. So Detroit wins this.
Yeah. We've talked about it in the last episodes where Houston is just not where they should be. The DeAndre Hopkins trade was baffling. And I think that, again, where it's like you look in the offense, you look at their defense, health questions in some areas, inexperience in others, questionable coaching, questionable front office. Detroit beats the one team that's worse than them when it comes to front office and decision making.
Yeah, the other Belichick disciple in Bill O'Brien. So this is going to be a battle of the Belichick disciples.
He was from Penn State. They corrupted him there. I blame that.
I mean, he wasn't even that good at Penn State. Let's
Nobody
not get
was.
started. You
Oh,
know, like this is the guy who thought Christian Hackenberg was going to be the next great quarterback, and we saw Christian Hackenberg might play baseball now.
I thought that too.
I thought he was
I thought he was going to be good, to be honest.
Skyler, remind me, wasn't Christian Hackenberg, was he committed to Nebraska, or am I totally making that up? Because I feel like at one point he was committed to Nebraska.
You are completely making that up. Christian Hackenberg had nothing to do with Nebraska. The player that you're thinking of,
somebody else. I swear to God that he was committed, or he was almost committed. I don't remember. Whatever, it doesn't matter now.
He might have been, but that would have been during the Mike Riley years, and I'd like to forget about the Mike Riley years. So,
yeah, back to Bo Pelini.
Yeah, right.
God no.
All right, moving on to a week 13 matchup. They go to Chicago to play the. Yeah, I know it's a fucking motorcycle outside.
Damn it, Krista.
Yeah, thanks. So week 13 matchup, they go to Chicago to play the Bears. I have them losing to the Bears in week 1. I have them losing to the Bears in week 13. I think at this point Chicago is going to be playing for some playoff positioning. I don't know if they're going to get there or not. But I think Chicago is just a little bit better matched. I think at this point Chicago is going to have their team figured out in terms of the quarterback position. It's going to be a cold game in Chicago. I got to tip my hat to the Bears on that one, and they end up beating the Lions.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you. Even though I had the Detroit Lions beating them in the first week, I think by this time of the year, the Bears' offense is kind of going to get figured out, and they're going to have a system in place. And with that, that's the only question mark I really had with them. And with that defense plus some type of offense, I think it's going to be good enough to mop the floor with the Lions.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, this starts a 4-game winning streak for Chicago for me. Is against Detroit, and it goes back to what we said in week 1. It's just the questions that they have. They haven't. Those questions will still remain, and whether or not it's Mitchell Trubisky or Nick Foles at this time, they're more solid on offense than Detroit is on defense. So.
Yes, Skyler, you were right. This does start a 4-game win streak for Chicago. So at the 3/4 way of the season, 12 games in, Skyler, you and I both have Detroit at 5-7. Mitch, you have them at 7-5. So Mitch, you have them fighting for playoff contention in a very pretentious NFC North. Week 14 matchup, they host the Green Bay Packers. I think at this point, very similar to the game against Chicago, Green Bay is going to be fighting for playoff positioning. I think Detroit's going to play this game really competitive, the way that Detroit seems to do against Green Bay, especially in Detroit. But I got to give it to the Packers here. I think the Packers just stack up way too well against the Lions. I'm going to go along the lines. I'm going to make a judgment call and say at this point the Lions' offensive line is decimated due to injury because I don't see how this team stays together. So Green Bay wins that game against Detroit.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think Packers are definitely going to win this. I just think they really outmatch them, and I think, with this late in the season, there's going to be injuries, and I think it's especially going to be on that offensive line, like you said, so that's going to create an even more advantage for the Packers, and I think they're going to get an easy win, and I'm predicting they're going to win on a Mason Crosby field goal.
Yeah, it's a shocking prediction considering the last 2 times they played each other. Skyler?
I don't think it needs to depend on a Mason Crosby field goal. I think that Aaron Rodgers, again, like I said in week 2, is looking at this the defense as a whole by this point, and going, because he's just going to tear him apart. He's got
like a
really good
pedophile?
Aaron Rodgers impression.
like evil genius kind of laugh
Sounds
because
more
I
like
think
a
that
pedophile.
Stop it. Skylar, finish your
Stop
point.
but I think that Aaron Rodgers just again he single-handedly he doesn't need to single-handedly beat Detroit, but he will because it's Aaron Rodgers. So
All right. Well, hey, third straight pick we've all agreed on. Week 15 matchup, they host the Tennessee Titans. You guys are a lot higher on the Titans than I am. It's kind of a vice versa over the Colts situation. I actually have Detroit beating the Titans, and here's why. I have so many worries when it comes to the Tennessee offensive line as well as the Tennessee defensive line. In the last episode, we talked about the huge loss Jarrell Casey is going to be. And I think interiorly, the Titans look bad right now. Questions at the linebacker position. They have a really good safety, but now their corners look decimated. And offensively, I just don't know if the weapons are there. I don't. Derrick Henry, yeah, he's good enough. But Derrick Henry was only good enough to get them to 9-7 last year. And yeah, they won some playoff games, and that's great. And that's awesome and good for them. But I don't know if success, I don't know if lightning strikes twice. I actually have Detroit beating Tennessee at Tennessee.
Well, I'm just going to say you're totally wrong. I think the Titans are going to easily beat the Lions. I think Derrick Henry, A.J. Brown are just going to have a field day with this Lions defense because I don't think anyone on the front seven is going to stop Henry. And I think A.J. Brown is going to have his way with those corners. And I think the Titans defense, even though they did have some big losses in Logan Ryan and Jarrell Casey, I still think they're solid enough to handle whatever kind of offense we see in the Lions at this point in the season. So Titans win.
I think it's going to be a close game. I think that again, it's two Belichick disciples going off against each other, but this is like the good Belichick disciple versus the bad Belichick disciple. I think that Mike Vrabel is everything that Matt Patricia isn't. I think he actually knows how to build a team. I think that being a player in the Patriot system is completely different than being a coach in the Patriot system. And he was part of like the original three Super Bowl winning team. So I think that I like I said in the last episode, I think Mike Vrabel is a good coach and will continue to be a good coach. And I think Tennessee wins the game because he'll find like he has the next, like I said last week, he has a next man up mentality. So these losses, while the people that are coming back and filling those roles might not be as good, he finds players that fit his system instead of just good players in general.
Well, Tennessee's quite a way down the list, but I'll be interested to get into that with you guys. Week 16, they host the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I don't see how Detroit wins this game unless the entire Tampa Bay team ends up getting COVID. And even then, I don't know if they end up winning that game. Tampa wins that game easily to hand Detroit their third loss in the last 4 games on my schedule.
I have Detroit winning. I think Barry Sanders and Kelvin Johnson are going to come out in retirement and beat Tom Brady. No, I'm just kidding. I think this is my prediction. If it hasn't happened already, Tom Brady is going to end Matt Patricia's career in Detroit. I think
that'd be something, man. That would be something.
I think Tom Brady is going to show us some vintage Tom Brady in this game and make the Detroit Lions look so silly. And I think both those Patriot guys and Patricia and Quinn are going to be packing their bags.
Yeah, I agree. I think Tom Brady has something to prove this season, and God help anybody that stands in his way. Honestly, Tampa Bay has one of the most explosive wide receiver cores in the NFL. They have one of the most criminally underrated defenses in the NFL. And when we get to Tampa Bay, I will explain why they are criminally underrated.
Thank you.
And I think that just in general that Tampa Bay is that at the end of this game Tom Brady will have cemented his position for the NFL MVP race at that time, because I think that he will be looking at it. I don't think he'll win it, but I think that he'll be, just by sheer age and the season he's about to have, he'll be up there in consideration. Win a few votes, but not that award.
All right. Well, then Week 17 matchup, they host the Minnesota Vikings. I have them losing this game. I think at this point, very similar to the games we talked about against Chicago and Green Bay, Minnesota's going to be fighting for playoff position. I think at this point, Minnesota's going to be fighting to try to get as high of a seed as they can. I don't have them winning the NFC North, but getting into it where they could maybe play a little bit of a lesser NFC team as opposed to maybe playing the Saints or the Niners or somebody in the playoffs, because we saw how well they did against the Niners last year in the playoffs. Detroit loses this game. Minnesota's going to come out and wallop them. Detroit finishes the season with a big fat L for Lions.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the Vikings are going to win. I think at this point will have obviously more to play for because I have the Lions out of it at this point, and I have the Vikings playing for a playoff picture. And I think by the last week of the season and probably earlier, I expect Dalvin Cook to be back on the team and playing like himself. So I think that obviously boosts the offense and give it a little more credibility, and it's going to get them over the hump, and they're going to beat the Lions.
See, I don't have Minnesota fighting for playoff contention at this point. I think that their early season, their beginning of their schedule kind of makes it hard for them. But again, I think at the end of this season, Detroit is really looking for something to prove that they're not the worst team in the NFC North. Because at that point, I think that's what it will be, them fighting for who's the worst in the NFC North, and I think Detroit wins the game.
All right, so you have Detroit winning that game, huh?
Yeah.
All right. So to finish out the season here, Skylar, you and me both have Detroit at 6-10. Mitch, you have them at 7-9. Mitch, you have them losing their last 5 games. They're actually 7-4 at one point, and you have them dropping their last 5 games. So 6-10 for me, with a 2-4 division record, puts Detroit at 4th in the NFC North. Not good enough for the playoffs. Mitch at 7-9. Do you have Detroit? Because you also have Chicago at 7-9. So do you have Detroit as 3rd or 4th in the NFC North?
Let's take a look.
Because I think you have both teams going 1-5 in division.
Yeah. I think I have the Bears as 3rd and Detroit as 4th.
Detroit at 4th. Okay.
Okay.
And then Skylar 6-10. Is that good enough for Detroit to be 4th in the division?
Yeah. Because I'm just gonna say yeah at this point because I think Minnesota is just a hair better than them. Not by much. I think the entire NFC North isn't too wide of a gap between all of the teams, but I think Detroit's the bottom of the NFC North.
Yeah, I agree. Both you guys have Detroit going 1-5 in division. I have them going 2-4, splitting the series against Chicago and Minnesota. You gotta win your division in order to have a solid chance. I don't think Detroit does that. They don't stack up well enough. I think this is Matt Patricia's last year because I don't think that the growth is going to be there in order to keep him around. You fire Jim Caldwell after back-to-back 9-7 seasons, and then in Matt Patricia's tenure, you're going to go 3-12-1 to 6-10. That's not a ratio that you can get. And I only say that because I don't remember what his record his first season was. I think it was also 6-10, but I don't remember.
Yeah, something bad.
So I think Matt Patricia's gone after this season. I think his tenure is over.
So who do you guys want as the head coach of the Detroit Lions if Matt Patricia is gone this season?
On one hand, I could see them hiring Dan Quinn from Atlanta if he ends up getting fired. I could definitely see that. I also wouldn't be surprised if they hire Kellen Moore from Dallas. I think that, got to remember, he played for Detroit for a little bit as a backup quarterback. I think offensively, if Dallas takes that step that we're expecting them to, even under the Mike McCarthy offense, I think it could be there, as well as let's not rule out Jason Garrett possibly going to Detroit. I think that's just a couple of names to throw out there.
Any guesses,
I think whoever the surprise Super Bowl contenders offensive coordinator is, because unless
there you go. Good point.
Because unless their GM's also gone, because I have to make this point again when we're talking about the Bears GM, where you come from an organization where you're consistently good, like the Patriots,
And he wasn't even the GM of the Patriots. I don't think. And really, any person that is a Patriot front office person and then goes to another organization, you didn't make the roster decisions. Bill Belichick does all of that. We all know that. That when you're consistently good, you don't know how to build a team. It's more important who they hire as their next GM, because I think they need to be able to build a team. So I would be looking at somebody from the Baltimore organization, somebody from San Francisco, somebody from maybe Seattle. I'm not sure. Where it's a GM that can build a team well, and work in lieu with a coach, because I think that whoever they hire as their GM will set the tone for the organization down the line. Because I think when you're that, unless they get a coach that can handle GM-like duties very well, that's like, if their GM stays after this season, they're not going to do any better, because they're going to do what every team does, which is hire some no-name offensive coordinator, quarterback coach, wide punting specialist from a team that's good. I'm looking at you, Giants. That is just they have the name, they're attached to an organization that does well, instead of them actually proving that they can do well.
Yeah, there's names that are going to be thrown around. I mean, nobody would have picked LaFleur to end up being the Packers head coach heading into his offseason. I don't think a lot of people picked San Francisco to end up getting Kyle Shanahan. I think that there was some understanding some other teams would. Other guys, Brian Flores wasn't a huge name being floated around until that Super Bowl against the Rams. So, names are always going to be thrown around. We're going to see how the season goes. But the next episode, we have our Green Bay Packers. And then, Mitch, I have no idea who we have after Green Bay.
Houston.
Yeah.
Houston?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Houston and Indy should be it.
Cool. So, yeah, we got a good couple of episodes coming up, teams that we've talked about quite a bit. And then we're going to keep you guys posted on the MLB situation as it progresses, on the NCAA situation, as well as on the NBA situation as well. Go back, listen to our previous episodes. You can find them here on YouTube. You can also listen to them on SoundCloud and Spotify. All Fourth String Sports Podcast. Find us on Twitter and Facebook, and send us an email, fourthstringsp@gmail.com. Lions fans, we'd love to get your hate. We want to hear it. We want to read it on air, and we want to talk about it. But I appreciate everybody listening. Please tune into the next couple of episodes here. We got some great teams, got some playoff contenders coming up, and then we have a team that I genuinely think Bill O'Brien would sell his own child for a second-round draft pick. But whatever. So, yeah, everybody tune in. Boys, before we close out, do you have any other closing comments?
Yeah, we just all got to keep hoping that everything goes according to plan with baseball, basketball, and football, and there's no other hiccups that are going to, detract us from, the starts of the seasons. And because I know I am ready, and I think everybody else is ready for some real sports to come back.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. I think that by the Indianapolis episode, we should know what NBA players are going to be reporting to the bubble. Because they're supposed to say by June 24th, I believe.
Yeah,
by then, we should also know whether or not the MLB is going to have a season, like in general. And then another thing, we have a subreddit I created.
Ooh.
Just for people, if a Reddit's something you guys like to do, we have one. It's th string sports.
There you go.
That's where it's at. I've been posting the episodes there. I'd love to get more people involved, trying to get more and more people up on that, because I recently discovered Reddit and I absolutely love it.
Reddit's cool,
and
yeah.
I think that I love it especially for fans that want to talk about really anything. It's a good way to reach us, or reach me specifically.
Yeah, this is a completely DIY thing. I know Mitch has talked about we're going to post some more polls on Twitter and stuff as this kind of progresses. Follow us on all that stuff. Follow us all individually as well. You can find us. We're all on those pages and stuff. So, yeah, I appreciate everybody tuning in. We got a good couple of episodes coming up. We're going to keep everything. This is a completely DIY podcast. We're just a couple of guys who just record some stuff. So we appreciate everybody for tuning in and listening. We're going to have this episode posted up, and then we're going to record the next episode here over this weekend. So I appreciate everybody for listening. Everybody have a good night and have a safe night, please.